Think on the energy radiating from the sun. The energy flowing with the wind, rivers and waves. The energy that emanates from the earth and biomass. There is a country capable of creating all this energy. This country is Portugal. Portugal has been at the forefront of climate action and renewable energy promotion at international level. Between 2005 and 2017, Portugal reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 18% and its primary energy consumption by 17%. In 2017, the share of renewable energy in total final energy consumption was 28%. Now, Portugal assumes new and more ambitious commitments for the 2030 horizon, in line with the national commitment to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. The National Energy and Climate Plan, together with other sectorial policies and strategies, translate these commitments. This plan aims to promote energy transition and the decarbonization of economy to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. Our vision is based on the certainty that energy transition is a unique opportunity for Portugal and decarbonization is a goal for everyone. One of the main objectives is the decarbonization of economy, which requires the implementation of an emissions reduction trajectory across all sectors of activity. We define energy efficiency as a priority, while investing in the reduction of energy consumption and the efficient use of resources, but also as a way to promote economic competitiveness. Buildings are one of the sectors with the greatest potential, with a special focus on rehabilitation and requalification. We will continue to focus on renewable energy, the cheapest way to produce electricity and therefore an opportunity to reduce costs for consumers. More renewables means to use more and better the endogenous resources, achieving greater energy independence for the country. Diversifying energy sources and its origins, while continuing to ensure the security of supply, is another main objective of this plan. The energy system of the future will be resilient and flexible, modern and integrated, and strongly interconnected. Decarbonization necessarily involves the promotion of sustainable mobility and its electrification, including the reinforcement of shared, connected and active mobility, together with the commitment to improve the supply and quality of public transport. Reducing the carbon intensity of agricultural practices and increasing their efficiency, ensuring more effective management of forests and increasing carbon sequestration are essential lines of action to implement energy transition in this sector. Industrial innovation is another essential axis of action, which implies the adoption of cleaner and more efficient production processes based on digitalization and circularity. The outcome, more competitiveness with fewer emissions. All these proposals are based on a just, democratic and cohesive transition model, one of the central assumptions of the National Energy and Climate Plan. When it comes to a future that belongs to everyone, it is essential to ensure an inclusive transition, ensuring that the opportunities are used equally by all. This implies acting on the protection of the most vulnerable and on promoting cohesion and territorial valorization. These are ambitious but realistic goals. The efforts made in the next decade will be decisive, and our ambition demonstrates Portugal's determination to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. The energy transition and the decarbonization of the economy are a great opportunity for the country and a mobilizing intent of the entire Portuguese society. This is a great strategic opportunity for the country, which implies mobilizing all parties involved. An opportunity to increase investment, employment and economic growth, thanks to the benefits in competitiveness and sustainability achieved through the transition to a carbon-neutral and circular economy that generates wealth and well-being. an opportunity for scientific innovation and technological advancement, as the road to carbon neutrality is also the path of knowledge and creativity. An opportunity for consumers who will benefit from access to sustainable and secure energy at the lower costs that renewable-based energy production makes possible. The National Energy and Climate Plan is an essential part of a broader integrated strategy that places decarbonisation at the centre of national public policies. This is the way to a future of economic prosperity and social progress, a more sustainable future. Its implementation requires the joint action of the entire society. This is a commitment of Portugal and all the Portuguese.
Good afternoon. It is with great pleasure that we welcome you to the high-level conference Sustainable Finance, New Developments, which takes place under the Portuguese Presidency of the Council of the European Union. The European Green Deal aims to transform the EU into a fair and prosperous society, with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy, where there are no net emissions of greenhouse gases in 2050, and where economic growth is decoupled from resource use. Becoming a climate-neutral economy by 2050 requires significant investment from both the public and the private sector. To achieve these objectives, the European financial system needs to become more sustainable. In this context, the EU has taken major steps to build a sustainable finance ecosystem that aims at increased transparency and provide tools for investors to identify sustainable investment opportunities. Today, with the participation of ministers, world-renowned experts, and representatives of international organizations, we intend to explore how markets and financial institutions can become a driver of sustainability, helping the European Union countries achieving their ambitions on an environment and climate. To welcome us and open the conference, the Minister for the Environment and Climate Action of Portugal, João Pedro Matos Fernandes, has the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to you all. The European Green Deal aims to transform the EU into a fair and prosperous society with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. Becoming a climate-neutral economy by 2050 requires significant investment from both the public and private sectors. To achieve these objectives, the European financial system needs to become more sustainable. The EU has taken major steps to build a sustainable finance ecosystem, which ensures increased transparency and provides tools for investors to identify sustainable investment opportunities. This also has a key role in channeling private investment to the transition into a climate-neutral, climate-resilient, resource-efficient and fair economy as a complement to public money. We live a particularly complex moment. The way the governments use strategic instruments to deliver environmental and climate action policies is key to respect the limits of the planet, the optimization and the rationalization of the materials, energy and natural resources, and funding. The COVID-19 pandemic brought us additional reasons to accelerate this transition and to pursue with renewed ambition our energy and climate goals. For the implementation of these reforms and for the energy transition, the EU's recovery instrument, New Generation EU, is key. The Portugal's Recovery and Resilience Plan includes investments in several different things. Sustainable forest management to protect and enhance resilience and promote biodiversity, water efficiency plans that will reduce vulnerability to water scarcity, energy efficiency in public and private building with a focus on households, renewable energy sources, including green hydrogen and the creation of renewable energy communities, sustainable mobility, including investments in the metro network, light rail and clean public transport fleets, bioeconomy, focused on the incorporation of nature-based materials in the clothing, footwear and resin sector, and the decarbonization of industry. Portugal's ambition in terms of sustainability is clear and complies with a threshold of 37% of its global investment allocated to climate transition objectives, while also complying with the do no significant harm principle. And I would like to point out that 85% of Portugal's national investment plan is allocated to sustainable investments. Sustainable investments must be prioritized, contributing to our energy and climate goals, while allowing to boost the economy. The transition to a climate-neutral economy, the protection of biodiversity and the promotion of renewable energy sources, including renewable gases, have the potential to rapidly deliver jobs, growth and improve the way of life of all citizens worldwide, and to contribute to building more resilient societies. Therefore, the financial sector can play a key role in promoting green investments by not ignoring the fact that the project risk analysis must include what the project is able to do for fighting or worsening climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy Regulation is an essential financial instrument in the green and digital recovery from the COVID-19 crisis to guide investors in the identification of environmentally sustainable activities and to apply the do not harm principle of the European Green Deal. The Banco Português de Fomento sets its core business in financing the ecological and digital transition, financing projects and initiatives aimed at the decarbonization of the economy, energy transition, as well as a focus on territorial cohesion. The new financial institution should act as a trigger to develop and raise key financial instruments to support the transition for circular and neutral economy model aligned to the recent EU developments in sustainable finance. The bank's mission is to develop the economy and entrepreneur community by financing solutions that address market failures in the access to financing. Its statute claims that in following this mission, it should also promote sustainability and focus on carbon neutrality. The grants the bank and a unique mandate for channeling finance towards decarbonization are really important. The BPF should focus on renewable energies, energy efficiency, transport and agriculture and land use sectors due to the potential of these sectors to the transition to circular carbon neutral economy and requirements of funding shown by most of the companies. As new green banking approaches can help Portugal achieve its green and climate ambitions, I've challenged Vivid Economics to develop a national study to assess the needs of national financial institutions to support sustainable investments. The result will be presented today, and I hope they can feed the debate. Let me express my gratitude to the European Climate Foundation and Climate Works Foundation for supporting this study. Ladies and gentlemen, the EU Taxonomy Regulation, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and the Benchmark Regulation form the foundation to increase transparency and provide tools for investors to identify sustainable investment opportunities. The European Commission adopted on the 21st of April of this year an ambitious and comprehensive package of measures to increase investment towards sustainable activities across the EU. The elements of this package will enhance the reliability and comparability of sustainability information. Also, will enable several future tools, such as the EU ECA label for retail financial products and the EU Green Bond Standard to be developed. The renewed sustainable finance strategy to be adopted by the Commission in July 2021 will further set out how sustainable finance will foster the transition to a sustainable and climate-neutral economy. This is an integral part of the European Green Deal and the Commission's overall efforts to ensure a sustainable and resilient economy recovery following the COVID-19 outbreak. Ladies and gentlemen, the National Carbon Neutrality Roadmap 2050 sets the path for Portugal for the next decades. Climate neutrality will boost investment in new technologies and products in Portugal. Transport and buildings represent the most significant part of the investment, 86% by 2050, namely in the electric mobility and the promotion of energy efficiency of buildings. The focus on renewable energies represents 8% of total investment by 2050, of which 32% is decentralized energy production technologies, which will increase progressively in the period. At least 85% of this investment will be private, companies and families. In this context, it is essential to create the conditions to facilitate and to attract the necessary investment through an articulated and coherent framework of sectoral public policies and to promote access to sustainable finance. The additional estimated investment required to achieve carbon neutrality will be around 86 billion euros until 2050. In other words, between 2.1 to 2.5 billion euros per year, which counts for 1.2% of gross domestic product. In 2019, the Task Force on Sustainable Finance established a set of ambitious objectives. Enhance the awareness to the impact of the upcoming legislative changes developed at EU level in the financial sector. Emphasize the importance of integrating environmental, social and governance risks into risk management process. Motivate the financial sector for the development of financial products that promote companies, social economy, institutions and projects aligned with the principles of sustainability. Mainstream the financing line supported by the Portuguese state, namely the credit line for decarbonization and circular economy. Develop a set of guidelines to promote involvement of different stakeholders, state, regulators and supervisors, financial institutions and civil society. The task is huge, but I'm certain that all together we can overcome this challenge and make a better planet to live. I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.
We will now hear João Leão, Minister of State and Finance.
Good afternoon to everyone. Climate change is already a sizable and visible reality. Ecosystems are already experiencing severe and potentially irreversible changes. The physical impact of both climate change and environmental degradation could significantly disrupt the function of our economies and societies and lead to substantial losses. In this area, international cooperation will be essential to fight climate change. Without it, all our efforts will fail. The US rejoining the Paris Agreement goals, the adoption of carbon neutrality targets in both Japan and China, and the COP26 in the UK this year paved the way for a greater international cooperation. In addition, it is also essential that developing countries grow in a sustainable way. The EU has the potential to support more both private and public investments in those countries. Together with other policies like green taxation and regulation, sustainable finance can play a crucial role. The EU should aim at also having a leading role in sustainable finance. One of the examples of this role is the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, a forum for dialogue between policymakers with the overall aim of increasing the amount of private capital being invested in environmental sustainable investments. Also, in the beginning of this year, the G20 agreed to relaunch the activities of the Sustainable Finance Study Group to improve sustainable reporting, to align investment to sustainability goals, and to enhance the support of international financial institutions to the Paris Agreement. These investments are key to meet the increased EU 2030 climate targets and low-term goal of turning Europe climate neutral by 2050. Estimates show that in the period of 2021 to 2030, Europe will need to invest 315 billion more each year in energy systems than it did in the previous 10 years to meet the target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 55% in 2030. It's clear that public money will not be enough to meet these investment needs. Only the private sector can provide the sheer scale to meet our green ambitions. Let me put this in another way. We know that emissions need to fall by 7.6% every year this decade in order to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit set by the Paris Climate Change Agreement. However, in 2020, global emissions decreased by 88% only due to the strict lockdowns during the pandemic. This makes it clear that the link between economic growth and carbon emissions need to be broken. And this is impossible with a massive reallocation of capital and investment. For this, it will be key to direct investors and business towards sustainable economic activities. For this aim, a common definition of what is considered sustainable is needed. To this end, the EU Taxonomy Regulation sets out a common classification system. It is one of the pillars of the EU Sustainable Finance and Climate Change Agenda and forms part of a wider package of sustainable finance legislation. It enables the creation of a number of tools that will create to ensure a just transition to reach our sustainability goals, such as, for example, the EU Green Bond Standard. During the Portuguese Presidency, the Taxonomy Delegated Act was adopted. It established the technical screening criteria for determining the conditions under which an economic activity qualifies as contributing substantially to climate change mitigation and adaptation. The Commission estimates that economic activities of around 40% of EU-listed companies in sectors which are responsible for almost 80% of direct greenhouse gas emissions will be covered by this delegated act. Another important file that the Presidency is working is the proposal for Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It will set a common European reporting rules requiring firms to disclose information on the way they operate and manage social and environmental changes in a consistent and a comparable manner. This will increase transparency and help investors, consumers, and other stakeholders to evaluate the non-financial performance of companies while encouraging them to develop a responsible approach to businesses. The Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive was adopted in April 2021 and will apply to all large and all listed companies, including listed small and medium-sized enterprises. Before I conclude, allow me to say a few words about the Portuguese case. The Portuguese roadmap for carbon neutrality 2050 estimates that the aggregate investments needed to climate neutrality by 2050 are close to around 1 trillion euros. Portugal is looking to mobilize investments from national, European and private investment funds. While this is an important start, it's not enough to meet the targets, and hence the Banco Português de Fomento can have contribute filling the green financing gaps. This banco plays a key role in coordinating different funding sources and enabling companies to assess funding, while guaranteeing that this funding aligns with national policies and the environmental, social and economic commitments. The green mandate is an integral part of the Banco Fomento mission. Naturally, other sources of financing, such as the Recovery and Resilience Facility and other European Union funds, will also play a key role to achieve these goals. Let me conclude. The Portuguese Presidency has set as one of its top priorities to ensure a green recovery while promoting the EU as a leader in climate action. I believe there is a very strong momentum to build back better. In this context, the green transition can help pave the way to recovery, creating jobs and growth, while involving huge investments from both the public and private sectors. We also look forward to the upcoming proposals on the renewed sustainable finance strategy, the legislative proposal on the green bond standard, and the legislative proposal on sustainable corporate governance. Thank you.
The EU Taxonomy Regulation, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and the Benchmark Regulation form the foundation to increase transparency and provide tools for investors to identify sustainable investment opportunities. The European Commission adopted on 21st April 2021 an ambitious and comprehensive package of measures to increase the investment towards sustainable activities across the EU. To present us with a renewed sustainable financing strategy, Marcel Haag, Director of Horizontal Policies, DG FISMA, European Commission, has the floor.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. As you know, sustainable finance is high on the European Commission's policy agenda. In its European Green Deal, the European Union set out its growth strategy for the transition towards a more sustainable and more resilient economy. The EU notably made a commitment to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. This is a challenging and ambitious objective. It will only be achieved if the EU and its member states work together and gear all their policies and actions towards this goal. Massive investments are needed for the green and digital transition of our societies and for meeting the objectives of the European Green Deal and of the Paris Agreement. Sustainable finance is key to mobilize financing for the investments needed. Public finance Sustainable finance is key to mobilize financing for the investments needed. Public finance alone will not be sufficient. The bulk of the investments will have to be financed by private resources. Policymakers are fully aware of the key role of the financial system for the transition. And the EU has been one of the first movers in developing a sustainable finance agenda. Already in 2018, the Commission has put forward a comprehensive roadmap for sustainable finance. The 2018 Action Plan on Financing Sustainable Growth created the foundations. From the outset, the objective has been to green finance, that is, to ensure that the financial sector itself becomes greener and more sustainable, and to finance green, that is, to ensure that the financial system contributes also to the financing of the transition of our economies as a whole. Overall, substantial progress has been achieved in making our financial system greener. The private sector has demonstrated a growing commitment to making its practices more sustainable, in line with the expectations of our citizens and the climate and environmental urgencies. And the demand for sustainable investment opportunities has been growing fast and continues to grow. Several legislative initiatives have been agreed at EU level to support the greening of our financial system, notably the EU Taxonomy Regulation adopted in June 2020. The development of an EU-wide taxonomy for environmentally sustainable economic activities is at the heart of our sustainable finance agenda. The taxonomy will provide a common language of what activities can be considered environmentally sustainable for the purposes of investment. This classification acts as a transparent tool by providing clarity and comparability to all companies and investors. For mobilizing the necessary financing, the taxonomy translates the EU's green objectives into criteria for investment purposes. It will help guide market participants in their investment decisions in line with our 2050 target. Making the taxonomy operational is a priority. A key component of the sustainable finance package put forward by the Commission a month ago on 21st of April is the EU Taxonomy Climate Delegated Act. It introduces the first set of technical criteria to define which activities contribute substantially to the climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation objectives. Further work is needed to complete and expand the technical screening criteria under the taxonomy. The criteria will also evolve over time in the light of requirements and scientific and technological developments. As part of the package of 21st of April, the Commission also made a proposal for a corporate sustainability reporting directive. This directive aims to ensure that companies report reliable and comparable sustainability information. Companies will have to report on how sustainability issues, including climate change, affect their business and on the impact of their activities on people and the environment. The proposed reporting requirements will extend to all large companies and all listed companies. The proposal foresees that separate proportionate standards are developed for SMEs, which non-listed SMEs can use on a voluntary basis. The package of 21st of April also included 6 amendments to delegated acts on investment and insurance advice, fiduciary duties, and product oversight and governance. The new provisions will ensure that financial firms will include sustainability aspects in their procedures and in their investment advice to clients. All elements of the package presented in April will support the financial sector and companies in the real economy in aligning their business models with our climate and environmental objectives. They will enhance the reliability, transparency, and comparability of sustainability information to support the transition and to prevent greenwashing. In just a few years, we made major steps, yet a lot still needs to be done to fully pivot our financial system towards sustainability, and we really need to accelerate our efforts. The pandemic has not altered this necessity. The European Green Deal remains a top priority, and the recovery from the pandemic needs to catalyze the green transition. The recovery offers an opportunity to modernize and digitalize our economies and to prevent massive disruption related to the consequences of climate change and environmental degradation. Therefore, the European Commission will present a renewed sustainable finance strategy in the coming weeks. This new strategy will build on the achievements under the 2018 Action Plan and will further set out how sustainable finance will foster the transition to a sustainable and climate-neutral economy. The new strategy will highlight how the sustainable finance framework can enable inclusive transition finance for all companies seeking to improve their environmental impact and support companies in their transition path towards sustainability. It will explore further ways to empower companies to transition from unsustainable to sustainable activities. Ultimately, we need to scale up private investment in sustainable projects and activities to support the different actions set out in the European Green Deal. Also this summer, the Commission will put forward the proposal for an EU green bond standard. The aim is to create a gold standard based on market best practice available to all green bond issuers on a voluntary basis. The future standard should give issuers of high-quality green bonds a reliable way to demonstrate their environmental commitment and alignment with the EU taxonomy. Let me also highlight that in order to accelerate the green transition at the pace required and in line with our ambition, we need coordinated efforts at the international level. Overall, we will need flexible approaches that promote global alignment while also acknowledging the need for different countries and jurisdictions to go further and faster according to their own political priorities. The prospects for international coordination on sustainable finance initiatives are increasingly promising. We already cooperate with 17 other jurisdictions in the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. From this year on, we're also resuming our work with several of our partners in the G20 Working Group on Sustainable Finance, and we are looking forward to cooperating closely with this year's G7 UK presidency in view of COP26 in Glasgow in November. Let me conclude by saying that a lot has been achieved since 2018 when the Commission presented its first action plan. But the journey is still long to reach our climate and environmental targets. Sustainable finance can make a significant contribution to guiding the way. Thank you for your attention.
The International Network of Financial Centers for Sustainability, which aims to accelerate the expansion of sustainable finance, allowing financial centers to exchange experiences, boost convergence, and act on shared priorities, is a partnership between the world's financial centers, comprising 33 member centers, including Lisbon. To introduce the International Network of Financial Centers for Sustainability, Mark Hale, Senior Advisor at the International Network of Financial Centers for Development, has the floor.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mr. Haag for letting us know what's happening in the European Union. It's always a very inspiring thing to listen to the leadership coming from the European Commission and its members. And as he said, there are so many links between that and what's happening at the international level. The Financial Centers Network has as its principal aim to accelerate the transition to sustainable forms of finance. And we believe that one of the fastest ways of doing that is to federate the financial centers that have a commitment to the sustainability transition, because financial centers concentrate all the financial actors, and they are a place where innovation takes place quickly, where technology is taken up more quickly, and therefore we feel that they can be at the cutting edge of what the European Commission just described as a very rapid transition to sustainable forms of finance. I would like to remind you that of the 35 now members of the Financial Centers Network, we cover every continent, and there's a reasonable balance between financial centers in the north and those in the south. And together, the membership of the Financial Centers Network represents about 85% of all equities traded worldwide. So this is a concentration of financial strength that is not inconsiderable. Now, in looking at sustainable finance, both through the experience of the Financial Centers Network, but also more generally, it is clear that we are in the midst of what we once called a quiet revolution, and that the accumulation of the different changes that are beginning to take place at a greater and greater speed could lead to a serious transformation of the financial system, one that the European Commission representative described as a better alignment to the real economy. I would like here, on the basis of the experience in working with the Financial Centres Network, to focus on 4 shifts that I think are happening, that we believe are happening, and that together represent a really massive change in the way the financial actors approach finance and governments approach the purpose of finance. The first is we are moving away from a time when we felt that making an ESG commitment was sufficient, that it was sufficient to report what one was doing, to disclose companies' activities and how their finances were spent. And now there's a very strong sense that reporting and disclosure, whereas they are necessary, they are insufficient in terms of what is required by companies to behave in a sustainable manner. In fact, the recent issue of The Economist looked at ESG commitments of corporations around the world and warned that there's a substantial amount of greenwash. So we are moving away from a time where we expected corporations to adopt policies and practices that were more friendly for the environment. And we're moving into a second phase. And this is a second shift I would like to draw your attention to. That is that there is now much more of an orientation towards corporations and financial actors' overall impact, their footprint, and an expectation that is growing very rapidly that they should be signing up to principles that we generally call do no harm principles, and to align to the new norms that are coming out of the intergovernmental world. So, for example, in the area of climate change, the obligation to comply with net zero carbon emissions is mounting very, very rapidly. And in the area of biodiversity conservation, there's an emerging standard that is usually called nature positive, which could emerge very quickly as a new norm aligning with net zero. But the impact is that financial actors are increasingly expected to align with a set of norms that ensure that their overall impact on climate, on nature, on other factors is at least not negative, and ideally is positive. And there is a tendency also with those norms to move from voluntary norms to those that are more constraining. And the example of the TCFD norms, I think, is telling in that respect. The third shift that we are seeing is a much stronger focus on the enabling environment. In other words, the laws and the policies that govern financial and capital markets, and the reform of those conditions to ensure that they align better with the needs of the real economy and of sustainable development. And an example given by the representative of the European Commission was review of laws governing fiduciary duty, fiduciary responsibility. We are finding that a number of policies that are in place, a number of the laws that are in place, give incentives that are contrary to the needs of sustainable development. And speaking of incentives, there's now increasingly a review of the incentives in place, for example, public subsidies, to see whether they align with the sustainable development goals or, in fact, in some cases, undermine them. We're looking at the systems that reward corporate behavior, the behavior of CEOs, to ensure that that does not provide incentives to undermine the environment rather than to support it. And the fourth trend I would like to signal is that there is a growing push for increasing the liability of financial players for the impacts of the activities that they finance. We have seen the emergence of a task force on nature-related financial disclosure, which is debating going beyond risk and looking at both impact and nature dependency. We are looking at efforts to improve and enforce due diligence regulations that ensure, for example, that investment doesn't lead to deforestation. There are legal moves that are trying to extend liability for environmental damage to the investors and the financial institutions that provide the funding for them, which would have the effect of greatly increasing the value of environmental risk. And we're seeing a whole body of law emerging that recognizes environmental crimes and that looks at recognizing and giving legal standing to the rights of nature, for example, natural features like rivers or coral reefs or others. And so I think that the combined effect of these four tendencies is going to be to precipitate a much more rapid evolution of the financial system to an expectation that they support, contribute to, and accelerate the transition to sustainable forms of development. And finally, I would like to simply underline two new frontiers that the Financial Centers Network is looking at, and that we believe will be extremely important in the years to come. The first one is the very rapid emergence of the field of biodiversity finance. We all, our financial institutions, our corporations, are all getting used to an obligation to finance climate change action, but very rapidly coming up behind it is a strong development in the notion that biodiversity finance is the next frontier and that we need to get behind it very quickly and establish the rules and the norms and the practices and the data platforms necessary to put it into practice. Second, and related to it, and very much related also to climate change action, is the growing interest in finance for land restoration. We keep speaking in terms of reducing the negative impact that finance has on environmental factors, but we don't give enough attention to the fact that there's a great deal of degraded land out there that with a reasonably modest investment could be returned to productivity and be returned to biodiversity. And so that there are areas where not only can we lower the rate of harm that we're imposing, but we can in fact give strong incentives to recover and move in a positive direction. So those are some of the things that are emerging within the Financial Centers Network. And I'm proud to say that the interest in and innovation around some of these factors is not coming only from the richer financial centers, but very much also from the financial centers in the developing continents. And so you can expect a far greater participation of the financial centers in these international debates and a far higher level of positive proposals coming from them to the financial actors, both within the centers and those that they partner with. With that, I would like to close. Thank you very much.
The European Investment Bank is the biggest multilateral financial institution in the world and one of the largest providers of climate finance. The mission of the European Investment Bank is to foster sustainable growth within the EU and abroad. To tell us about this important role, Ricardo Mourinho Felix, Vice President of the European Investment Bank, has the floor.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. And let me start to say that it's always a great pleasure to be here in Lisbon to participate in a conference with such illustrious speakers that represent institutions with whom the European Investment Bank forged strong partnerships. So my sincere thanks to the invitation for the chat. After 1 year into the pandemic hit, the global economy continues to witness an immense disruptive impact. In Europe, we really feel this impact in our lives, in our economies. On the one hand, we feel investment, along with other economic activities, contracting precipitously. This results not only from lockdown measures, but most and above all, from the impact of the pandemics in the economic confidence, in the confidence of the citizens, in the confidence of the people. And it's this confidence that we need to revamp. But at the same time, firms face a post-pandemic new normal that calls for a radical shift. Investments in digitalization, in innovation, and climate is now even more pressing. As a result, large parts of European economy could be left behind if they fail to invest enough. No doubt that moving towards a green, more inclusive economic model is an imperative. It is the most urgent challenge of the 21st century. And the EU is stepping up with a comprehensive toolkit to support a sustainable economic recovery. As the EU bank, we are playing our part in the coordinated European action without precedent. This time, it was really different. It was really different from the great financial crisis because we made it different. We made it better. We all stood together and we all acted promptly, in full coordination to give a response and to rise to the challenges of the pandemic situation. As the EU bank, we work side by side with the European Commission to support the achievement of the European Union goals. The European Union institutions are working together to meet the EU policy objectives on the recovery, on the climate agenda, on the innovation and digital transition, leaving no one behind. This is critical for our success. If we leave some regions or some sectors or some parts of our society behind, we failed miserably. There's no time to fail. We need to prove and we need to move forward together, leaving no one behind. The EIB provides financial structures, including blending of our lending and equity instruments with the EU and national grants and guarantees. We also provide advisory support to public and private project promoters. At the core of this comprehensive menu of products and interventions is the quality of the public investment, an imperative for crowding in private sector investment and private sector resources. This translates into a strong focus on delivering high value-added investment. We focus our action on impact, on additionality. This is far more important than the volume of our funding. The EIB is a cohesion bank, not only by statutes, but by genetics. This is part of our DNA. We are working on cohesion on the European Union since our inception in 1958. It was, let's say, a while ago. We support projects that ensure that green and digital transactions will happen, that will be made for the benefit of all EU citizens, leaving no one behind. Please keep this in mind. We must leave no one behind. COVID pandemic turned our attention to the urgency of protecting our citizens. That was inevitable in the context of these terrible pandemics. It turned our attention to the preservation of jobs, to sustaining living standards, to keep a regular or as regular as possible functioning of our economy. But one cannot lose sight of the structural challenges we face. Fight climate change, foster innovation, and promote digital transition is just imperative. We are one of the world's main financiers of climate and environmental action. We are the first multilateral development bank to align its new operations with the goals and principles of the Paris Agreement. To make this ambition a reality, in November last year, we approved the Climate Bank Roadmap that sets out our strategy to be the EU Climate Bank. The roadmap is a 5-year plan for the European Investment Bank. It ensures that we support a green recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. It is our strategy to put in place the European Green Deal and to ensure a just transition for all. And we keep supporting countries outside the EU, contributing to the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals at a global scale. Since the beginning of this year, we aligned all our financing activities with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We are fully committed to allocate at least 50% of our finance for climate action and environmental sustainability from 2025 onwards. Today, we are at 40%. There's still a way to go over the next 2.5, 3 years to reach the 50% target. We are tracking our investment in line with the framework established by the EU Taxonomy Regulation. The taxonomy results from a key effort of the European Union in the past 5 years to improve transparency in sustainable finance, to fight greenwashing strategies, whatever they are. The amount of investment needed to tackle climate change goes well beyond public resources. Capital markets play a major role in gathering private resources, and they are already doing it. Green, social, and sustainability bonds are growing fast. They are still a small part of the world bond market, but they are the most dynamic part of it. The EIB pioneered the green bond market back in 2007. We are pushing for the potential of growth of this unique investment tool. In 2020, the EIB issued a record volume of 10.5 billion euros in climate awareness bonds and sustainable awareness bonds. We more than doubled the 2019 issuance. We see an increasing demand for the green and sustainable bonds in the market. And we have targeted this demand by extending sector eligibility, by aligning bond documentation to the EU taxonomy to ensure that we are already fully prepared to meet these requirements. The financial system and sustainability needs to be closely connected. The EU is moving quickly in this direction with its action plan on financing sustainable growth. We have contributed to the landmark EU taxonomy for sustainable finance, establishing clear, robust definitions of green investments and by requiring the proper reporting. The taxonomy will attract more investment for the multitude of new projects that create a low carbon global economy. We need more cooperation on sustainable finance across European institutions, but also at a global scale. We need new initiatives, well coordinating, involving more and more countries and more organizations. This is a global effort, and in this sense, the EU International Platform on Sustainable Finance is a major step. It's in fact a quantum leap towards fostering more dialogue beyond European borders. And we are very proud to continue working with our colleagues of the European Commission, in particular in this dimension. We have also a fruitful cooperation with the United Nations Environment Programme to deepen cooperation and effectiveness and to achieve common goals and objectives. Common objectives in the field of climate change, in the conservation and enhancement of natural resources, including biodiversity. EIF, our subsidiary for venture capital, became a signatory of the United Nations-sponsored Principles for Responsible Investment, which shows the opportunities for engaging across the European Investment Bank Group. I would like to highlight one of our key priorities for this year, the review of our environmental and social policy standards. This lays out the policy context for our contribution to green, fair and inclusive development. The standards ensure that we apply the highest standards and forward-looking solutions to tackle challenges ahead. With the review, we intend to reflect the latest EU environmental and social sustainability policy objectives and legal requirements, notably the EU Green Deal, the legislation related to the EU's package on sustainable finance, and InvestEU. But the review also considers new climate and environmental sustainability commitments outlined in the Climate Bank Roadmap. We are aligning our practices and we take on board the feedback from external shareholders and stakeholders and from lessons learned. We strengthen social and environmental considerations in our decision-making process. And we ensure that our clients and financial intermediaries manage the risks and duly consider the impacts in the projects they have, the impact of the projects on society and on environment. Importantly, we seek to maximize opportunities to create positive impacts through EIB activities. All this in a holistic approach that effectively balances environmental, climate, and social sustainability aspects. I'm very pleased to let you know that we'll shortly launch a public consultation on our environmental and social sustainability framework. We invite all interested stakeholders to participate actively and responsibly. Let me conclude by telling you that last Tuesday, I had the honor of ringing the bell at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange to celebrate the 1000th sustainable bond listing on the Luxembourg Green Exchange. That's a landmark. 10 sustainable bonds, 1,000 sustainable bonds listed. This clearly shows how far we can get when we put our efforts towards something that really matters. What in 2007 seemed a childish, naive dream became in 2021 the cutting edge of the mainstream financial markets. Sustainable finance is now the future. No financing, no business, no project will hold in the future if it's not sustainable. In the 21st century, sustainability gained a completely new meaning, a meaning that goes well beyond financial and economic sustainability. The sustainability of the 21st century is environmental and social sustainability. These are necessary conditions to ensure economic and financial sustainability, a truer and deeper meaning, a more humane sustainability. Thank you very much.
Emmanuel Guérin, Executive Director for the International Group of the European Climate Foundation, will introduce us to the theme Climate Finance, a Perspective. The European Climate Foundation is dedicated to responding to the global climate crisis by creating a net zero greenhouse gas emissions society. Emmanuel Guérin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be with you today for that important even if of course I would very much prefer to be with you in person in Lisbon. And I'm very excited to come after a few speakers from organizations who play such an important role in the financing of the transition to a carbon neutral and climate resilient economy within the European Union. And before we discuss a bit more specifically in the next session about the paper by Vivid Economics and the operationalization of the Banco Português de Fomento. Please excuse my Portuguese. The foundation of the bank and the recommendations included in the paper, of course, is a very important milestone into an ongoing participation with our partners at the Climate Works Foundation and within the Sustainable Finance Development Task Force. The creation of the bank on the cusp of such a decisive decade for climate action represents a new avenue for Portugal to realize its ambitious targets in harmony with an equitable and inclusive recovery from the pandemic. Financing for the energy transition in Portugal has, of course, already yielded some very significant results. Portugal, in particular, has notably already exceeded its original published targets on energy transition through accelerating the phase out of coal and electricity production by almost 9 years, in no small part due to the increased financing for offshore wind from the EIB and from others. In a landmark year, as Portugal eliminates coal and energy production, the capitalization and the operationalization of this bank marks an excellent opportunity to gather further momentum, not only in renewables, by the way, but also in those sectors with more acute public financing needs. This is really a time to scale up on additional challenges. In establishing the Banco Português de Fomento, Portugal has taken an important step towards boosting the economic recovery and admitting the climate investment gap. As the vivid economics paper notes, the investment gap is great in Portugal. An additional 85 billion roughly will be needed to meet Portugal's targets of achieving climate neutrality by 2050, which is about 1.2% of GDP per year. But this is where national development banks can play a critical role in catalyzing this investment. And where the bank can serve as a model for other European governments seeking to close this investment gap. But to truly transform financial flows to achieve our 2030 and 2050 climate goals, we must ensure that climate is mainstreamed across all investments. That is very important. So I'm delighted to see the progress that Portugal is making here. I think one of the key challenges for the bank is going to be to interpret its climate mandate broadly and to make sure that climate is factored into every investment decision the bank makes. Learning from past experience in other development banks is, of course, going to be critically important. Many are struggling today to align all of their operations with the Paris objectives. And so the creation of this bank in Portugal is an opportunity to set the systems right from the outset. Critical to this task, I must say, is making sure that the bank has a robust list of exclusions. No fossil fuel investments, no coal, oil, or gas should be contemplating if we're truthful to our promises and response to what science is telling us is needed. And to truly accelerate the transition, robust support is needed, not only in the energy sector to renewable sources of energy, but also in mainstreaming climate resilience in any investment across all sectors. This will mean ensuring climate is integrated into sectoral strategies and project appraisal methods, monitoring and reporting on the real climate impact of investments, and building climate expertise at all levels of the organization, including among senior leadership. And this is why I'm very pleased to see that the European Investment Bank is here today, as they indeed can truly share from their experience in putting climate at the center of their operations, and not just in last year's Climate Bank roadmap, but in all their efforts took in the lead up to that milestone. So today's conference is an excellent opportunity to share and learn from these experiences and start putting the building blocks into place so that Portugal and Europe more generally can clearly take the lead. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the rest of the discussions.
We will now take a short break, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Think on the energy radiating from the sun. The energy flowing with the wind, rivers and waves. The energy that emanates from the earth and biomass. There is a country capable of creating all this energy. This country is Portugal. Portugal has been at the forefront of climate action and renewable energy promotion at international level. Between 2005 and 2017, Portugal reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 18% and its primary energy consumption by 17%. In 2017, the share of renewable energy in total final energy consumption was 28%. Now, Portugal assumes new and more ambitious commitments for the 2030 horizon, in line with the national commitment to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. The National Energy and Climate Plan, together with other sectorial policies and strategies, translate these commitments. This plan aims to promote energy transition and the decarbonization of economy to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. Our vision is based on the certainty that energy transition is a unique opportunity for Portugal and decarbonization is a goal for everyone. One of the main objectives is the decarbonization of economy, which requires the implementation of an emissions reduction trajectory across all sectors of activity. We define energy efficiency as a priority, while investing in the reduction of energy consumption and the efficient use of resources, but also as a way to promote economic competitiveness. Buildings are one of the sectors with the greatest potential, with a special focus on rehabilitation and requalification. We will continue to focus on renewable energy, the cheapest way to produce electricity and therefore an opportunity to reduce costs for consumers. More renewables means to use more and better the endogenous resources, achieving greater energy independence for the country. Diversifying energy sources and its origins, while continuing to ensure the security of supply, is another main objective of this plan. The energy system of the future will be resilient and flexible, modern and integrated, and strongly interconnected. Decarbonization necessarily involves the promotion of sustainable mobility and its electrification, including the reinforcement of shared, connected and active mobility, together with the commitment to improve the supply and quality of public transport. Reducing the carbon intensity of agricultural practices and increasing their efficiency, ensuring more effective management of forests and increasing carbon sequestration are essential lines of action to implement energy transition in this sector. Industrial innovation is another essential axis of action, which implies the adoption of cleaner and more efficient production processes based on digitalization and circularity. The outcome, more competitiveness with fewer emissions. All these proposals are based on a just, democratic and cohesive transition model, one of the central assumptions of the National Energy and Climate Plan. When it comes to a future that belongs to everyone, it is essential to ensure an inclusive transition, ensuring that the opportunities are used equally by all. This implies acting on the protection of the most vulnerable and on promoting cohesion and territorial valorization. These are ambitious but realistic goals. The efforts made in the next decade will be decisive, and our ambition demonstrates Portugal's determination to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. The energy transition and the decarbonization of the economy are a great opportunity for the country and a mobilizing intent of the entire Portuguese society. This is a great strategic opportunity for the country, which implies mobilizing all parties involved. An opportunity to increase investment, employment and economic growth, thanks to the benefits in competitiveness and sustainability achieved through the transition to a carbon neutral and circular economy that generates wealth and well-being. An opportunity for scientific innovation and technological advancement, as the road to carbon neutrality is also the path of knowledge and creativity. An opportunity for consumers who will benefit from access to sustainable and secure energy at the lower costs that renewable-based energy production makes possible. The National Energy and Climate Plan is an essential part of a broader integrated strategy that places decarbonisation at the centre of national public policies. This is the way to a future of economic prosperity and social progress, a more sustainable future. Its implementation requires the joint action of the entire society. This is a commitment of Portugal and all the Portuguese.
Welcome back to the high-level conference, Sustainable Finance, New Developments. The creation of the Banco Português de Fomento, a national promotion bank, offers an opportunity to accelerate and catalyze the investment in decarbonization in Portugal by mobilizing the private financial sector and bringing down the cost of capital, while also promoting economic growth and entrepreneurship. This study provides information to operationalize green approaches within the Banco Português de Fomento, applying best practice methods from existing green finance institutions to the Portuguese context. To present us the study Green Bank Approaches for Portugal, supporting the operationalization of the Banco Português de Fomento, Nick Kinsmill, Engagement Manager, and Ana Barbedo, Economist, both at Vivid Economics, will take the floor.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Action for the opportunity to present this work to you today. In this session, my colleague Ana Barbedo and I are going to provide a brief overview of this work conducted on behalf of the Ministry and of the Banco Português de Fomento, supported by the European Climate Foundation and the Climate Works Foundation. Excellent, thank you very much. Could you move to the next slide, please? Great, and I want to just start with a brief introduction to our work and the green investment context to set the scene. Yes, please move to the next slide, thank you. Firstly, I want to note that the Portuguese government's plans for catalyzing green investment through the BPF really represent an ambitious response to the challenges and the context that the country is facing right now, some of which we've heard from earlier discussions throughout the day. The first is obviously the increasing focus and momentum around mobilizing green investment and the particular focus on private investment in the run-up to, for example, COP26 in Glasgow this year. And that comes in the context of the obvious new challenges that have arisen due to COVID-19, but also the substantial opportunities to invest in a green recovery that delivers both the strong economic and green benefits that are needed looking forward into the future for Portugal. And at the same time, the recognition and the drive towards mobilizing and seizing investment opportunities from critical private actors, and also the potential to use European Commission and European Union investment to help support a green recovery. And all of these challenges come in the face of an increased focus around the world around the role of green banks to catalyze and enable this critical green investment. For example, we've seen activity from Rwanda to the United States to Mongolia to the United Kingdom, and indeed in Portugal. And in this context, it's worth noting that the BPF includes in its mandate a really bold plan and demands around supporting these challenges through climate and broader green investment in its key priorities. Could you move to the next slide, please? So in that context, our work aims to help operationalize this mandate for green finance within the Banco Português de Fomento by assessing the investment focus and the capacities needed through 4 steps, trying to understand first the critical market context, the sectors that are needed to be focused on to deliver Portugal's climate ambitions, but also those sectors that have the greatest need for finance and are having the greatest challenges in realizing the investment potential. Second, in understanding the tools that are available to the BPF to actually support this effectively and what challenges in the financial sector they can overcome. Thirdly, understanding the capacity that's needed, both within the broader financial sector and within the BPF itself, to deliver these supports in practice. And then finally, providing recommendations on next steps for the BPF to support green investment in practice, including both direct activities and partnerships. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Anna to run through some of the findings on financing and approaches, and then we'll end with the recommendations. Anna?
Thank you, Nick. So to assess what green sectors the BPF should focus on, at least on an initial phase, we need to understand financing needs of these green sectors, but also challenges with green finance at a broader market level in Portugal as well. So if I could get the next slide. Starting with our sectoral finance needs, according to Portugal's roadmap for carbon neutrality by 2050, reaching this net zero target will require substantial green investments across all sectors. So going through each of these sectors one by one, electricity requires a 99% emissions reduction by 2050. This is relative to a 2005 baseline. And the investment that will be required in order to reach this reduction is also substantial. Here we show additional finance as a percentage of total investment needed, because as the roadmap clarifies, there is a part of this investment that will be met by the modernization of the economy in any way. If we then look at transport and buildings, which still have very high emission reduction targets, this is also shown by then the additional finance needs that are still substantial as well. Transport actually has the highest additional finance in absolute terms, but when we compare that to the overall investment that's needed in the sector, we get the 8% that we see here. Industry, which is a challenging sector to decarbonize globally, this is also reflected by the 73% emission reductions target that we have here, as well as the higher additional finance as a percentage of total investment that we then see. And lastly, agriculture and forestry, which is a very important sector, has similarly an ambitious emissions reduction target, as well as a slightly different investment needs. It's just treated slightly differently in the roadmap as well. So this should give us an idea of the sectoral needs for green finance that we see in Portugal. So in the next slide, I want to consider not only green sector challenges like we just did, but also broader financial market challenges with green finance that we do see in Portugal. So the private financial institutions and the providers of green products that we interviewed and surveyed said that they've actually faced similar challenges with green finance, which does show that, despite green sectors being at different stages of maturity and having different needs, there are overarching challenges to green finance in Portugal. So starting with the challenges in supplying finance, we were told that there are certain uncertain and fast-moving policies, particularly in the environmental side, that sometimes hindered project development and investment pipelines. Then we were told that there was a lot of lack of data and information for green investment projects, particularly regarding their risk and return profiles, which then led to more complex analysis and greater technical knowledge required to conduct assessments internally. And throughout the whole project lifetime, we're also told that there were general difficulties with monitoring, reporting, and verifying the results of these green investments. On the demand side, we are seeing similar things. So often providers of green products quoted that their returns were misunderstood, that there were perceptions of higher risk associated with the perceived novelty of the technologies or the business models that they were providing, and then also accumulated in a lack of specialized financial instruments that took into account the distinct structure of green investments. So as you can see, there are cross-cutting challenges to green finance in Portugal, alongside our sectoral needs as well. So after looking at these two different aspects, we can start assessing which green sectors the BPF could initially focus on, what it could prioritize. So in the next slide, we are identifying the sectors that should both have a need for additional finance, of course, but also have some potential of becoming fully privately financed. So we want sectors to get to this box on the rightmost side. So to go through our findings for each sector, assessing their commercial and financial viability, starting with waste here on the left side, we found that returns for investments in waste were often uncertain, and there were additional technology risks to consider. Then going on to agricultural and land use management, we saw that there's a lot of potential there, but again, some risks associated and a very hard difficulty in monitoring, reporting, and verifying results from these investments. As we start going into transport, we see that returns are more established. This is also associated with technologies which are more mature. But there are, again, some concerns about enabling environments, mainly around capacity of grids or the infrastructure necessary to uphold these investments as well. When we look at energy efficiency, both across industry and buildings, We said that returns, again, tend to be established and stable, but investments can be a bit small, and particularly in the building sector, quite fragmented. If we then go into other renewable energies, this is very dependent on the technology that we're talking about. But as we know, hydropower is a very mature technology, while biomass and hydrogen are very new technologies that come with those associated risks as well. Then looking at wind, in the case of Portugal, this is mostly, or actually all onshore wind, very close to being fully privately financed. Then solar is actually the closest sector, the closest green sector to becoming fully privately financed. It really has the most potential. There are just perhaps some constraints around the size of investments, particularly when we're talking about residential rooftop solar. So from this, we recommend that at least in an initial phase, the BPF should focus its activity almost as a learning curve in renewable energies, transport, energy efficiency, as well as agricultural and land use. And this is a very broad reach of sectors, but there are opportunities within each of these sectors. And it's important that the BPF, or that we work with sectors all along this commerciality curve to ensure that we progress across sectors over time as well. So in the next section, I want to start mapping financing tools and instruments to the objectives of the BPF and the needs of green sectors. So in the next slide, we can see that there's a whole range of tools that a green bank or a financial institution like the BPF can use to address investment needs and challenges. And this diversity very much reflects the diverse and the different needs that we see in these sectors. So we've grouped them into slightly different categories here. We have capital provision tools, where we directly provide or issue capital at market or preferential terms. Capital facilitation, which provide risk-reducing measures and help access capital from private sources. And we have tools that help address investment mismatches, particularly related to the size or time profile of the green projects. These are all under our bucket of hard tools, which are tools that catalyze private financing or that directly provide capital itself. Then we have our soft tools, which facilitate green investment. Here we're talking about tools that can help flows of information, that can support capacity building through technical assistance. And we're also talking about tools that can lower perceived risks and increase awareness of projects themselves. On the next slide, we have a long list of tools under these categories. It's a little bit too long to cover in depth today, but we do want to highlight some interesting tools as an example of what the BPF could do. We're doing this using case studies, so examples of what other financial institutions have done in the past, again, to bring a little bit more color and examples to what the BPF could do. So on the next slide, starting with our preferential terms loans, they have been, for example, used in the former UK Green Investment Bank for a municipal street lighting project. What the BPF could apply this quite easily. It has extensive experience with loans and credit lines from its founding institutions. It just now needs to apply this experience and knowledge to green sector projects. And you could also follow the example of the EFRU credit line, which is often quoted as a successful and best case example of a credit line. When we then look at credit enhancement, a good example of this is the US Department of Energy Loan Programs Office that offered guarantees to renewable energy investments and projects. Here, the BPF can again apply its extensive experience and knowledge from its founding institutions to green projects in order to address kind of perceived risks associated with these green profiles. Then our last case study is with aggregation and securitization. This is a structured finance tool where small projects and loans are bundled together, usually in a technique called loan warehousing. And then this bundle is securitized into a tradable asset. This has been used by Connecticut Green Bank as well as a multitude of other US green banks. And again, the BPF could deploy an instrument like this in sectors where it would be interesting, for example, dealing with small-scale energy efficiency projects. We could see this happening by, of course, a first stage of aggregation and then a second stage of securitization that could happen in tranches or potentially even through an SPV or a special purpose vehicle structure as well. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Nick, to take us through recommendations. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anna. So just to round off this presentation, I want to briefly bring together the findings on financing needs and challenges that Anna ran through to think about then the potential responses and the next steps for the BPF and others supporting the BPF to realize this potential. So on the next slide, we have an overview of the recommendations for activities of the BPF across the 4 critical sectors that we outlined in renewable energy, transport, energy efficiency, and agriculture, areas where there's still substantial investment and different needs for support. And what we've identified here is a range of sector-specific tools that may be needed, but also some cross-cutting skills and tools that are needed both within the BPF and to support the broader financial sector. Again, I don't think we want to run through all of these, but to provide an example of some of the aggregation tools that Anna just mentioned in the renewable energy sector for smaller rooftop solar projects, to provide tools to manage the risk for large-scale mass transit or fleet electrification investments, or to provide earlier stage support for agriculture products that need to prove the commercial potential around them. So in addition to these sector-specific tools, there's also a range of cross-cutting skills that are needed both within the bank itself around understanding the returns on green investments and conducting due diligence for those investments, but also in supporting those areas across the broader financial sector, as well as providing technical assistance both to project developers and investors to help get deals across the line, as well as investor liaison services to help connect interested investors with the projects that are practically feasible on the ground. So how can the BPF make steps towards using these tools? On the next slide, we present some steps and activities. On the left-hand side of this slide is the first step, which is really around building on its existing strengths from the founding institutions that form the BPF, where the BPF has a lot of experience in more traditional investment tools around, for example, guarantees, credit lines, and equity financing, and we'll need to apply these tools to new contexts and new situations in green sectors. But in addition to this, it obviously needs to develop additional capacities in a number of areas around the specific additional financing tools where it doesn't have a long track record, such as aggregation, such as lease-based financing and other forms of debt financing, but also in providing those external green capacities to support the market more broadly around technical assistance and market making, while also at the same time building its own internal green capacities to be able to conduct due diligence, to understand the returns on investments, and also to blend finance and undertake investments in collaboration with private actors directly. And then finally, there will also need to be some activities around complying with some of the EC regulations around taxonomy and disclosure that were mentioned earlier to make sure its activities are in line with best practice for sustainability. Now, this sounds like a lot, and indeed it will be, but there are some steps that can be taken in the short term around building on that existing experience, at the same time as bringing in additional staff with specialized experience in green investment and collaboration with other financial institutions, both private and public, such as the EIB, to get the BPF going in the sector and promote activity. And then in the longer term, it can focus on building the in-house capacities that it needs through providing training for using soft tools and for the specific green capacities that are needed, at the same time as learning by doing through its short-term activities and its partnerships that allow it to develop into more of those specialized tools in the slightly longer term. So moving on to the final slide to conclude, I just want to note that while there are obviously still a number of challenges that remain in the near term, including weathering the ongoing COVID-19 crisis and promoting recovery, and the need to operationalize the BPF and embed these new approaches, it's also worth noting that there are really substantial opportunities right now that can be seized from the inception of the BPF by aligning with green stimulus approaches and aligning with the increased global ambition that's being led. And that actually the really ambitious approach that Portugal is taking here with the BPF puts it in a position to be a leader on green finance within Europe through the BPF's unique positioning, its experience, and its bold mandate. Thank you very much.
We will start the panel, Green Bank in Portugal, Challenges and the Real Impact on the National Economy, where experts and banking leaders will share their diverse perspectives about the challenges that Banco Português de Fomento will face and its significant impact in Portuguese economy. We welcome the following speakers: Beatriz Freitas, CEO of Banco Português de Fomento, Luís Lajinha de Sousa, Executive Board Member of Banco de Portugal, Cristina Casalinho, CEO of Portuguese Treasury and Debt Management Agency, and Ricardo Mourinho Felix, Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Ilmi Granov, Director of Sustainable Finance in Climate Works Foundation, will be the moderator of this session.
Bom dia, bem-vindos. Eu sou Ilmi Granov, é prazer moderar.
I'm Ilmi Granov. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel. I'm sorry that I'm not there with you in beautiful Lisbon. I won't continue to torture you with my Portuguese, and I will proceed in English.
Allow me to introduce myself briefly, along with the rest of the panel. I direct the Climate Works Foundation's work at the intersection of climate and finance. And Climate Works works globally with climate philanthropy to maximize the impacts on climate change of philanthropy and the transition to the mid-century decarbonization objectives. We, along with our close colleagues at the European Climate Foundation, from which you heard earlier, have been involved in supporting Portugal's development of a development finance institution with climate transition to put it at the center of Portugal's recovery, development, and transformation. And this has been part of Climate Works' global efforts to establish public green banking institutions in both industrialized and emerging economies around the world, encouraging the deep transformation of existing public development banks as well. We have, for example, cheered the transformation of the EIB as Europe's climate bank, while also fostering the establishment of institutions like the Banco Português de Fomento and a federal green bank in the United States. I would offer just a couple framing comments before we kick off that, in my view, any 21st century public development bank must have climate at the center, adapting the economy to the impacts of climate change that are now arriving and accelerating the economy to decarbonization. I also have the honor of serving at the University of College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose as a senior researcher, where research has shown that public investment has a unique ability to bear risk and steer private capital into new markets and sectors. Research there has also shown that public banks work best with a clear, defined, and limited mission. Vivid's analysis of the specific opportunities in Portugal really reinforced these messages. And I'm really encouraged by the potential focus of Banco Português de Fomento on digitalization and decarbonization in the context of recovery. So with that comment, I want to turn to my amazing panel, really a remarkable group of speakers. And we will take the whole panel's time if I were to go through their entire resumes, but I do think it's worth just more than the one-line introduction. So I'll briefly do that, and then we'll turn to some questions for the panelists. With us today, we have Beatriz Freitas, who has been the chairman of the board of directors of the Banco Português de Fomento, this Portuguese development bank, since its creation last year, the end of last year, and has chaired the Sociedade de Investimento, the Investment Society, since 2017. She has also served as a deputy minister in several national administrations in Portugal. Luis Laguna de Sousa is a member of the board of directors of the Banco de Portugal. Before joining Banco de Portugal, he held various managerial roles in Portuguese and multinational companies, and for several decades also served as a lecturer at the Portuguese Catholic University. Cristina Casilino is a chairman of the board of directors of the Treasury and Public Debt Management Agency, IGCP, where she has served since 2014. And previously, for 9 years, she served as the chief economist at Banco BPI. Ricardo Mourinho Felix is vice president of the EIB and has served in that role since October. Has served in that role since last year. Mr. Mourinho Felix has oversight of the bank's funding and treasury, economic analysis, and research activities, lending operations supporting the blue economy, migration response, and several aspects of the EIB's role on the European Green Deal, also overseeing relations with rating agencies, national promotional institutions, the OECD and think tanks, and institutional relationships with Spain, Portugal, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Latin America. Before joining EIB, Mr. Mourinho Felix was Deputy Minister and Secretary of State of Finance in Portugal for 5 years and served for 20 years at the Banco de Portugal. So with that really remarkable background in mind, I have a set of questions for the panelists. I'll start by queuing up, I think the way that I'm going to run this to make sure that we're timely, because so far we've been really keeping on track in today's schedule. I have a sort of framing question for all the panelists, but I'm going to pose that here and then move immediately for all the panelists to keep in mind. I'm going to move immediately into that together with the first set of questions for the first panelist. Otherwise, we may not get through everything, and there's a lot of good stuff to cover. So as the background question for all panelists, I will note that the report outlines multiple barriers to private sector investment in green sectors and services, which are already transforming the economy, but perhaps not at the rate and scale that we need to make the economy recover resiliently and towards mid-century decarbonization. Some issues from risk perception to early deal complexity. So for all the panelists, I'll ask you to keep in mind this baseline question, which is, what do you see the role of the Banco Português de Fomento to address these market gaps and to mobilize finance for sustainable growth? How does it complement, support, and steer private market actors? So with that in mind, it is such a broad question. I think I want to ask that you all keep this in mind. I'm going to turn to Ana Beatriz Freitas with a sort of building on this. So in addition to kind of thinking about and communicating to us how you see the Banco Português de Fomento addressing market gaps and mobilizing finance and complementing the private sector, I want to kind of dig one level deeper. The report notes that the financial sector faces challenges through the whole cycle of green investments, from data and complexity issues to misperceptions of risk, return, and results. To counter these challenges, some of the roles that the Banco Português de Fomento can serve is as an information provider, a facilitator of green investment, addressing risk perception and complexity, also supporting due diligence and green monitoring, reporting, verification. I'd like to hear where you think the institution can serve best in these different functions. How might it do these things? How quickly do you think that the Banco can scale up these new approaches and adapt to new sectors? And how can others, like the EIB, engage with it to accelerate it? Ms. Freitas, would you mind beginning?
Hi, thank you. So you begin with me. Yeah, I'm the institution. Okay. And thank you a lot for the invitation. It's very tricky. You put on several very tricky questions, but first of all, I think so. BPF is a national promotional bank, and such as our mission necessarily revolves around the mitigation of market gaps in the access to finance. And in particular, and we are very aware of that, those market gaps that are related to green projects and sustainable finance. Those are very specifically relevant to us. And one of our main issues is that Portugal intends to reach carbon neutrality by 2015, and our mandate is really connected with it. So as Anna presents in their slides, and Anna makes a strong. Anna Barbero made a strong commitment, and the present of the commitment that we have with that, and we are very engaged in that in this mandate. But as all the members of the financial family, if we can call it that, BPF itself, as you said, must also implement green process and develop green and sustainable capacities in order to comply with all the requirements that are imposed to us, and that we are commitment not in the national. Not in national with national requirements, but also with European requirements. I think that one of the main issues that we have today is that all our finance, all our funds of finance must be compliant with this green process that we are engaged with. So InvestEU is all the InvestEU is very related to the development of green economy, and even and mostly the recovery and resilience plan. All the investments must be compliant. Must be compliant with green finance. So these requirements increase our commitment to develop this process. So when you ask me if we are committed to develop internally and to deliver to our partners all that is needed to the requirements to this process, my answer is we have to be compliant with this process. We need to develop everything that is around this process. Otherwise, Portugal will not be able to deploy to the economy all the finance that we have from the Commission. So this is something that we are very compliant with, and it is in our minds and in our process, and we are really trying to develop this internally, because the work begins inside BPF and inside all our divisions. we must be prepared not only to be able to address these issues internally, but also to as an investor, because when we are going to invest, we must also invest as in green. And that's something that we already begin to work, and it's not easier, as Anna and Nick said, because in the products that comes from the past, and we already know it's easier. But in new products, it's really a challenger, and there are inside our process, and to input all of this in our process on our risk analysis, it's very demanding, and there is not too many information in the market, as also Anna and Nick already explained us in their presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Freitas. Turning to the next panelist, I'm not sure if the organizers, I don't see my other panelists on here on the screen, so I'm not sure if they're here. If anyone wants to chime in, but I will. Just to confirm, is Mr. Laguna de Sousa on the line? Excellent, great. I'm sorry I can't be there in person with you, Mr. Laguna de Sousa. At this moment, climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic both have massive socioeconomic consequences. Solutions to both the pandemic and climate change require strong global cooperation across the public and private sector. Against this background, what factors do you consider key to helping Portugal achieve its green and climate ambitions and ensuring a response to COVID-19 while contributing to the stability of Portugal's financial sector and enabling robust future economic growth?
Well, first of all, thank you. I would like to start by thanking for the organization for the kind invitation to participate in this conference or in this panel, addressing a topic that is probably one of the few that is capable of challenging the position of the pandemic in terms of relevance. It's an invitation we cannot refuse. I would also like to salute my fellow participants in this roundtable. It's really a great pleasure to be here, not just because we are talking among people instead of being behind the screen, although there are still some of us behind the screen, and this being here brings a sense of normality, but also because I do welcome very much this opportunity to address the critical issue of sustainable finance and climate change. And I would like here to bring, I will not move away from your question, but I think it's important to also talk a little bit about the perspective of a central bank. So if you allow me, I would use a couple more minutes since, you know, central banks are unique animals, I would say, and so it's important to probably say a few words about the perspective of central banks before moving into more detail. And I'll try to stay in sync with the time slot that was allocated. And coming to this first topics I would like to cover, you know, the perspective of the central banks. There are mainly four key messages I would like to stress. One has to do with acknowledgement, the other has to do with the green recovery, the other with roles, and the fourth one with mechanisms. And if we think about acknowledgement, what I would like to say is that Bank of Portugal, in its role of central bank of the Portuguese Republic, acknowledges and both the national and the global relevance of the sustainability issues. And this means that the environmental, the social, the governance issues, they must be regarded as relevant for both the world economy and also for the Portuguese economy. We also recognize that climate change is a global risk that calls for global cooperation and solutions. And we believe that there is this need for urgent, for coordinated, and for determined action on a global scale in order to cope with the impacts that lay ahead of us. When it comes to the topic of green recovery, which is my second point, before saying anything else, and just for the sake of clarity, let me just add that as a central bank, we do not dispute the scientific claim that we need to move towards a carbon neutral or even negative economic model. And having this in mind and coming to this, my second point of green recovery, if science is right about the importance of moving towards a carbon neutral or even a carbon negative economic model, then the critical importance of climate change and other long-term sustainability issues, they cannot be pushed aside by the urgency of the pandemic crisis. There is clearly a growing consensus that is being formed around the notion that COVID-19 has had a huge short-term symmetric impact, but it will ultimately lead to asymmetric outcomes as the crisis follows its course. And the consensus is also growing around the group that of those that underscore that the synergies between the need to crawl back from the current crisis and the need to advance towards carbon neutrality. So I think that the notion of green recovery has been by now repeatedly stressed, and there is still a long way to go in that path. The third remark I would like to make is about roles, and roles. By roles, I mean the roles that each economic agent, that each agent has to perform on this path towards a greener and more sustainable future. And I start by stating something that has become, I would say, very obvious, is that if we are to succeed in the collective endeavor of mitigating and adapt to climate change, then the entire society must contribute. And we're talking about corporations, we're talking about consumers, we're talking about NGOs, scientific community. They all have a role to play. And since all really means all, that means that it is also the case for financial sector, which of course includes the entity we're talking about today, but also central banks. But one thing we should not forget is that the root cause of climate change, of the problems around sustainability, is probably what can be considered as the largest mispricing phenomena that mankind has ever witnessed. And if we believe that we are dealing with an economic problem known as a negative externality, then we have to conclude that climate change must be tackled first and foremost by political authorities. They are the ones who have the legitimacy, who have the control over the most effective instruments to deal with the root of the problem. And coming to my fourth and last point, before addressing more specific question you've raised, which addresses mechanisms, and the mechanisms which are more likely to produce the desired outcome in terms of shaping economic agents' behavior. and the view that we have here is that the climate change, the climate policy is more efficient if it builds on market mechanisms. And of course, we have to say this, we have to state this with a caveat. And the caveat is that such mechanisms, they must be allowed to operate in an open and competitive way, which in turn requires preserving a level playing field. If we look at what have been the recent developments regarding the European Union's emission trading system, they can be seen as a good example. The price of carbon allowances in the ETS market has been hitting consecutive records since late 2020. It rose above 56 euro per ton last week, which compares with the 23 euro that at the beginning of this rally. And if we go back to 2018, that was less than 8 euro per ton. So this trend follows, of course, the announcement that have been made that the aim is now to go for 55% reduction of greenhouse gases, and the previous target was 40%. And so this seems to have been perceived as an indication that the carbon permits will become scarcer and therefore more valuable. So the price that is effectively paid is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful influencer of economic agents' behavior, and choosing the mechanisms that allow the true cost of products and services to be reflected in their price, which includes their respective negative externalities, is clearly, whenever possible, the best option to consider in order to follow this path. On the topic of the specific, the more specific, the question that you raised, about what can be the role of an institution such as the Banco de Fomento. It's important to stress that as a central bank, we clearly have to, stay equidistant from all the participants in the market, but it's not difficult to understand that given the magnitude of the risks that are related to this transition, to the challenges we have ahead, given the magnitude of the investment needs that lie ahead of us, the solutions, they have to be provided by a combination of alternatives, which of course will open the door for many different entities that can provide this combination of alternatives to participate and to have their role in this huge challenge that we have ahead of us, both in terms of understanding and managing the risk component, but also in terms of helping and taking advantage of the opportunity component.
Sorry, thank you so much for your response, Mr. Laguna Sousa. If we have time, we may follow up further on complementarity between different types of public financial institutions, but it was really, really insightful. Mrs. Castellino, I wanted to explore, in particular, issues around green bond issuance and green financial assets and the growth of in sustainable finance in Portugal. In particular, the European Commission has been developing an EU green bond standard linked to the EU taxonomy to enhance the effectiveness and transparency and comparability and credibility of the green bond market. Furthermore, President von der Leyen announced the establishment of an EU green bond standard among the key new initiatives for 2021. What do you expect the effects of this standard to be for green banks and for green sovereign issuance? And in fact, if you have any comments on Portugal's interest in green sovereign bond issuance, it would be great to learn more about that as well.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here today. I brought some slides with me that I'd thank you to putting them on display, please. Thank you very much. So to address your question, I focus my presentation on a little bit the market pitfalls that the European Commission is trying to address, and also in a way that promotional banks in Europe have been playing a complementary role to the role that sovereigns also play in these markets. So one of the aspects that I would like to focus today is the fact that we are actually looking at a market that it's I wouldn't say it's in infancy, but it's actually in its teens. It's still, and we are going through a coming of age process. We have to bear in mind that everything almost started in 2007 at the time that the EIB launched its first green bond. It took about 7 years for ICMA to publish its green bond principles, and then you had Paris hosting in 2015 hosting COP21 that actually was a major landmark in terms of climate change and gathering the political will to bring more awareness to the need to really tackle this challenge. Then things speed up, and we had in 2017 the launching of the first green OAT by France. That actually was a major breakthrough in terms of issuance of sovereigns, in the sense that it freed the market from what were considered the shackles of green financing, in the sense that up till then there was the need to earmark expenditures to the issuance of bonds, of green bonds, and that with the new issuance, the new bond issued by France, this hurdle was removed, and we entered a new paradigm that allowed a number of European, but not only Euro area countries to pile on this new trend. So if I can, sorry, it's not working. The pointer is not working. Where should I work? Thank you. So if I can share some slides with you and some numbers on one of the things that we can say is that sovereign green bond issuance, or ESG labeled bonds, is relatively small when compared to the overall sovereign issuance. If you take the Euro area sovereign issuers that tend to be one of the most frequent issuers in this market, you can see there on your left-hand side chart that the bars are relatively high, but the dots that correspond to the percentage or the relevance of green bond issuance to the overall that stock, you can see that it still sits below 2%. And so what we still see that this market is mostly dominated by corporates and supranational and agencies, and as is the promotional banks. And here I believe that Banco Português de Fomento will play a relevant role in terms of financing, and that will be complemented by sovereign issuance. One of the things that we've seen these days is that this is a broad-based trend. Emerging markets have been also quite eager to participate in this market, but as contrary to what we've seen in Europe, it doesn't seem that green bonds are the most popular format. So while in Europe, green bonds is the most popular issuance format, that's not the case for emerging markets, where we see sustainable or sustainability-linked bonds or social bonds to actually being the ones that are more that been attracted more attention. If we now move on to this. Move on the second slide, I'd like to share here with you is actually to provide some indication of our illustration of what I already said. So you can see that, yes, Europe is taking the lead. First of all, when you see the outstanding of ESG labeled bonds, you can see that it amounts to roughly 110 billion euros, which I think to put it in context, the Portuguese debt stock amounts to 770 billion euros. So it's the outstanding of ESG labeled bonds is more or less half or close to a third of the Portuguese debt stock. And what it's also interesting to see here is that actually Europe is taking the lead here, while you see that 70% of these outstanding corresponds to Euro area sovereign issuance. On the right-hand side chart, you see that actually sovereigns are latecomers to this process. Both corporates and supranationals and agencies have been much more engaged with this market, and they have been fostering the development of it. So if we know, but we see that the contribution of sovereigns are the efforts that sovereigns have been committing to this market have increased quite substantially. And you can also see that demand actually has been driving supply. So you see that on the left-hand side chart, that where we have an illustration of the investment funds directed or flows directed to ESG labeled funds, you can see that there has been a very significant increase. These increases accelerated quite strongly last year. And we also see that these sort of, the increase of these investor base has pushed investors, has pushed issuers into being more committed to supply to this increased demand. One of the interesting features that has also fostered this trend is the fact that given the existence of this captive demand, what we see is that in some cases, for the same issuer, having a green or a social or a sustainability-linked bond, it actually allows some score uplifting in the sense that it earns them a little bit of an extra interest saving. And this is one of the reasons why we see, on this next slide, if I manage to really go into it. Here, what we see is that we've been talking a lot about costs, and the report mentions that it seems that it's difficult for investors to assess the cost of or the real quality of the green assets, and also it's difficult to define or in the price discovery process is a little bit blurred. But what we see here is that it doesn't seem to be so much the case when we consider not only the sovereign space but also the agency space. You see there that, for instance, in the case of the German twin bond, the bond that Germany has launched at the same time as of a conventional one, in a way that they have come up with a scheme or a mechanism that allows a swift provision of liquidity to the green bond in a way to allow it to perform in terms of price in exactly the same way of a conventional bond. You see that actually the green bond trades at lower interest rates, which means that there is a premium that investors are willing to pay to hold these bonds. And the same can be said about EIB. When you look at the conventional bond yield curve of EIB, you can see that the green dots that correspond to the green bonds, actually they sit below the conventional bond yield curve. So it really pays off for issuers to issue ESG labeled bonds, because they are going to save taxpayers' money. One interesting thing here is that we understand that this is something that we witness at this time, but it's not something that we are not sure how long-lasting this effect can be. Because if the demand actually steps up very considerably, if we have a very strong scaling up of supply, we are not sure that this sort of premium that we witness these days will be retained in the future. One of the things that we are facing today is the fact that there is still some skepticism around investors in terms of in order to assess the quality of the assets that underlie the green bond or the ESG labeled bond. And there is a lot of commitment by authorities in order to bring new legislation, in order to bring more transparency to the process. And what we see here is that these efforts put by authorities have been also accelerated very strongly lately. And in what we see in Europe is that the European institutions are taking the lead, and actually all the new legislative initiatives by the European Commission are really reshaping the investment landscape. And one of the things that we are facing is the fact that the standards in this market, given its infancy, the standards in this market tends to be very limited and also quite rudimental. And having an evaluation process and having a third opinion or scrutiny participating actively in the green bond or ESG labeled bond issuance, it allows for the skepticism that some investors still have to curtail all the drawbacks of the self-labeling effect that we still face, and it also kind of mitigates also the risks of greenwashing. I think here, if we take if I take your question regarding the European efforts to set up or to lay down the green bond standard, it hinges very well on the need to address this challenge in order to bring more comparability to this market, in order to bring more standardization in a way to foster supply and to allow also investors to have a better understanding of the bond that they are buying, or actually what sort of green commitment that lies behind the bond that has been issued and bought. If we now move on to the following slide here, the idea here is just to bring to illustrate how strong has been the commitment of the European institutions to actually enhance clarity and into this market and to foster standardization. A lot of initiatives are going on. All of these will happen this year, and all of them will intend to promote a level playing field, not only at the time of issuance, but also at the time of investment. One of the interesting things that we need to address is that there is still, despite these initiatives, there are still some market fragmentation. And what we see these days is that it's true, and I mentioned this earlier, when I mentioned that emerging markets, for instance, are very eager to take on new bonds, on bonds with new characteristics. For instance, people talk about the blue bond or some rainbow bonds. And the thing is here is that we may, in order to cater for specific needs of niche investors, we may go for fragmentation. And if we pursue this path, we may end up with a situation where this greenium or this premium that we are enjoying may be diluted by fragmentation. It might be difficulty in investors to actually be able to benefit from the scaling up of this market. If we now moving on to next slide, here are key criteria that investors assess when they in their decision-making process. And one of the aspects that still lack clarity and harmonization is for instance, if refinancing is allowed or not. Here, what we consider here is the fact what you consider the timeline for the use of proceeds. And we see that the look-back period differences varies very significantly between countries. In some countries, we take a 3-year period, and we can see the investments that were done the previous year, in the current year, and in the following year, in the next year. In some countries, what we see is that the look-back period is 3 years long, and so it's very difficult for investors to really assess the quality and the commitment of servants to really green financing. So we need to really come to a standard in a way not only to avoid fragmentation, but also to allow investors to face an easier decision-making process, and also to facilitate this comparability in this market, and also to build what we usually say, to build yield curves. That meaning to have issuance of these bonds with different, very significant or very different tenors. And I would stop here the presentation. On your comment about the European initiatives, I really think that they are very valuable. They will be key for the development of the industry. And this level playing field, this is something that the industry has been very vocal about the need to have it, and the need to really make because otherwise, if you don't have this level playing field, it will be very difficult for the industry to really develop at the pace that we need in order to have financing available to the projects that will not be only coming from the next gen EU, but also that all countries, all European countries, will need to put together, or will need to implement in order to meet the decarbonization level targets or objectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the course on the state of green bonds in the European system, and really potential quite relevant market for the Banco de Fomento in Portugal. Turning to Mr. Mourinho Felix, I have quite a number of questions for you. I'll try to go through them slowly to make sure that they can land, but I think the relationship between the EIB and the Banco de Fomento is a very important one. The EIB's mandate now consists of supporting EU policy objectives, which include promoting innovation and skills, access to finance to small and medium-sized businesses, strategic infrastructure, and very importantly now, climate action. How do you envision the optimal relationship between the EIB and the Banco de Fomento? How would we marry the strengths of the EIB and its scale with the local knowledge and the relationship to Portuguese businesses, and including in particular SMEs of the Banco de Fomento? How do you expect to partner with national level development institutions, including this one?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And let me start to thank the invitation and for such a panel with quite reputed colleagues, to say that DIB is already working and works with national promotional banks. And we work with national promotional banks as partners in projects, in EU programs, to bring them to life and to make them the most effective, the most impactful, and to bring the most additionality possible. Concerning the Banco Português de Fomento was created not that long ago. In fact, in my previous functions, I was in the inception of this project of merging the three institutions to become Banco Português de Fomento. And I would say that it will play a very critical role in targeting the Portuguese firms, the Portuguese SMEs, where the bank has a lot of experience and a lot of data from the previous relationship, in particular by the SPGM, by Sociedade Portuguesa de Garantia Mútua. And this is a very key asset for Banco Português de Fomento. But then comes the issue of the green, and the question you asked first about how to mitigate a market gap. Let me say that these days, I think that more than speaking about market failures and market gaps, I think the role of national promotional banks is mostly about creating markets. This is just a different way of looking at the same issue. If there's a market failure, it's because market does not exist or is not deep enough, and that's the role of national promotional banks to create markets, to make these markets deep enough. And that's a good example of this is the green bond market. That's what the EIB did in 2007, was creating a market that does not exist to target a challenge that by that time was still seen as a naive and childish dream of a number of people, and that today is a mainstream challenge of the 21st century. So can the Banco Português de Fomento fill this gap? And the answer is clear and easy, yes. And the next question is how? And the reply is easy. It's by becoming a green bank. The next thing is the most challenging one. And I can confess you that after 5 years as Deputy Minister of Finance and Secretary of State of Finance, if I think about these 5 years, my biggest frustration is that after 5 years fighting fiercely, jointly with Christina, to print a green bond, after 5 years, I didn't manage and I left the ministry without printing the green bond, but I'm sure that shortly Christina will do it. And why was it possible in 5 years to bring this to life? And the question is the issues you mentioned first, is that the green market, the green bond market is very demanding. It requires a quite significant setup costs by looking at projects, selecting projects, having second opinions, creating infrastructure, monitoring, because when you enter the green bond market, and markets, it's about confidence, and Banco Português de Fomento is a bank, and well, financiers used to say that the value of an asset, of a bank, is the net present value of future cash flows. I would say that in a bank is the net present value of its confidence, because a bank that loses confidence loses its value. This means that to become a green bank, you need to set up the appropriate infrastructure, which is quite complex and quite demanding. But if you don't have this infrastructure and if you enter the market running the risk of being caught in greenwashing, that's the worst thing you can do. So if I can give some advice, is for Banco Português de Fomento to become a green bank, first set up the appropriate infrastructure. And the good thing, I would say, is that it's much easier for a promotional bank to set up this infrastructure than the task that Christina and me tried to do during that period. Because a budget, a state budget, is not a project-based budget. This means that it's much more difficult to identify the projects that can be put in a portfolio and then monitored through a period. While for a bank, like the Banco Português de Fomento or like the EIB, that are project-based banks, it's much easier because you identify projects and you analyze it project by project. What are the challenges that the Banco Português de Fomento needs to face? Well, first, a green bank and a sustainable finance institution is not created by setting up, let's say, a financial sustainability department or a financial sustainability unit. You need to infuse the institution by this, creating the appropriate KPIs. And all activities in that bank should be subject and assessed against these KPIs. And these KPIs should involve sustainability, should involve climate action, should involve environmental action, should involve also social sustainability, and a number of dimensions that cannot be extremely large, but that need to be 4 or 5 that infuse all departments of the bank. And then this should be in the DNA of the operational frontliners that take the deals, but also in the RM, in the risk management. And the risk management of a green bank needs not only to account for the financial risk, but also to account for the climate risks. So all projects, and we do this at the IB, have a climate or environmental rating that says how much this project contributes and how much this project is prone to the impacts of climate action. That's, I think, it's a very critical issue for a green bank. And the third issue is related with compliance. Knowing your customers, knowing who is on the other side. And this is related to the issue of confidence I mentioned previously. The worst thing that can happen to a green bank is to finance a company that is promoting a presumably green project that is, in the backside, financing brown activities. This destroys the confidence of the market. So compliance, knowing the customer, knowing who is on the other side, and create a confidence relation with the customer is extremely important in order to ensure that the green bank is delivering properly. So I would say this is the key setup. How the IB can help? The IB can help by doing operations with Banco Português de Fomento. We are already doing this. We have set up last year Portugal Blue. Portugal Blue is a venture capital fund targeted at blue economy startups. And this is a way of learning by doing, working together with an institution that started quite some time ago and that is still evolving, that is facing still challenges, but that has now a setup that is quite solid. Other vein of work is through technical advisory, and the IB advisory services are already providing advisory in many dimensions, in particular in what concerns sustainable finance, and that's something that we are more than happy to work with Banco Português de Fomento in parallel with doing more and more operations. Of course, that's how do you set up a green bank? After having the infrastructure, you need to look at the business plan, and you need to develop a business plan. The bank, EIB, end of last year, we have defined our climate bank roadmap, and we decided that 50% of our funding from 2025 onwards, meaning something like 35 billion euros, will be addressed to climate action and environmental sustainability. This means that part of our capital will be allocated to these activities. That's a critical thing. The rest, the remaining 50% of our funding or less, will go to activities not related to climate action and environmental sustainability. But if you are a green bank, you need to ensure that this 50% of funding will not go to activities that are brown, activities that will harm environment. So we need to align all activities of the bank, being it climate action or not, with the Paris Agreement, such that some part of the funding is addressed at green activities, and the other part does not undo what you are doing in the green part, contributes passively, if you want, to greening. Taxonomy. The taxonomy, I would say, it's something that was quite substantial European Union effort over the last 5 years, and that will bring certainty to the investors. We'll ensure investors and define what is green and what is not green. And that's very important, as the market is flourishing and is still a quite small market, as Christina said, but is quite dynamic, is increasing quite fast. So this means that we need regulation in order to ensure that greenwashing does not destroy this market as it increases in its size, and as the current setup for ensuring that activities are green will not become operational for a much larger market, and the market is growing quite fast. This, of course, creates challenges and imposes costs of entry into these markets. Climate risk assessment and climate risk ratings is something that is key, and it will come in the future. And then, as it was mentioned by Christina, there is the discussion about the Greenian. And when you look at the EIB curve, you see that there is a small Greenian. In fact, will there be a structural Greenian? Well, Margaret, the most honest reply is to say, you never know, it depends. I would say that we are not fully convinced yet that a green exists. We can see some gains, but I would say that is mostly determined by a quite substantial appetite for green assets, for sustainable assets, and the supply that is still limited, which is a good thing, since we want to bring more and more. So creating more green and more sustainable assets may well lead to the elimination of the green. I would say, and I would claim, but that's kind of not a belief, but some structural or theoretical thinking that there's a reason for being green. Because contrary to normal bonds, there is much more scrutiny on the utilization of the funds that go through green and through sustainable bonds. And if there is more scrutiny, investors, in principle, have more information. The more information you have, the lower is the risk. So maybe a lower interest rate may materialize, and this creates this difference that we can call it green. But that's more a theoretical reflection than empirical evidence that already exists, but that's something very important. If that exists, in fact, for public and for sovereign bond issuers, is a way of saving taxpayers' money. For national promotional banks, will be a way of transferring financial advantage obtained in the market to their customers, and will allow many SMEs to benefit from green bond markets. It's obvious clearly that an SME with such a small structure will hardly set up or have the setup to issue green securities. So they need to go through a financial intermediary. And since private financial intermediaries are not yet supplying this type of services to SMEs, the National Promotional Bank might well be the way of structuring this type of financing, getting together financing for green activities by SMEs, and issue bonds and securities in the market that will allow the transferring of this financial advantage. So that's quite important. Going to the question you raised related to the SMEs and the role of Banco Português de Fomento and its local knowledge. I would say that it's extremely important. That's the reason why for us the IB group is so important to work with the national promotional institutions. They have a better knowledge of local markets than what we can have at a higher level. When you say that the financing is limited or more limited to large-sized companies, well, at the EIB is more oriented to large tickets, in fact, but the EIF, the EIB subsidiary for SMEs, is working through financial intermediaries and extending funding towards SMEs. Last year, through EIF, we made 1 billion out of 2.3 billion of activity in Portugal, which is funding towards SMEs intermediated by the Portuguese banks and by the Banco Português de Fomento through and issued by the EIF. So that said, there is a great opportunity to continue working with Banco Português de Fomento. It is a relation now for some years, and we are more than happy to make it deeper and to create a relation that brings more value added and more additionality for the Portuguese economy that should go well beyond the volumes of funding extended.
Thank you so much for addressing that question head on and giving us context for how the EIB has approached its climate role, which will be really relevant to the Banco de Fomento. I want to, in the last few minutes, I think it's appropriate to give the chair of the Banco de Fomento the last word. So, Ms. Freitas, I'd like to come back. There have been a couple things that have come up, and I'd like to hear your views on them. In particular, while there's a lot of attention to the green bond discussion right now, not all green companies or projects will be ready for the public debt markets. The core, it seems, of the institution's role in catalyzing climate in its investment is really this market creating role. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you see the Banco de Fomento playing this market creating role. And in particular, there's now this green taxonomy in Europe that outlines what sustainability is, but it strikes me that it doesn't really tell us where an institution like Banco de Fomento should be market creating. It describes activities as being sustainable, but it doesn't tell us in sort of what stage and what types of financing and investment are needed and what role a public institution like Banco de Fomento can have. So if you could speak to that in these remaining just a couple of minutes, we're getting close to time, but I think it's important to give us your vision on that before we close.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for their views on what is our role. I think we are very aligned with everything that we are very aligned with all all the panelists are saying. Relating to taxonomy, I think that taxonomy, the EU green taxonomy, give us a view and a transparency about what is green. It's like to have give us a way to talk with investors and with clients and with all the stakeholders. So that's what taxonomy give to us, a way to talk in the same and have the same language, and that really facilitates our role in terms of what is our mission to become green as what we say. I think all the promotional, regarding your other question, all the promotional banks in the few months really need to be green, because all our finance will be green. It's not just green bonds. All the programs that came from the Commission must be green. So we are talking about green finance, a role to Europe. If you want to apply if you want to apply our funds of finance, we really need to point into green projects and to green development. When we are talking about green, really, as we see at the presentation, we are talking about circular economy, we are talking about digitalization, because all that projects lead us to green projects. So, but really, what really is very difficult for us, and I think Ricardo Mourinho Felix pointed that in their presentation, it's to find KPIs that allow us to have a connection to the project and to what the economy really needs, and to put our clients, so SMEs, mostly the SMEs, talking about talking so green as us, and that's our main goal. It's to in the next, because we don't have too much time to do it, really. We need to adapt very, very quickly. Otherwise, we will not be able to apply all the resilience plan that comes from Europe. So we have to work very quickly. It's really, first of all, something that we have to incorporate, like IAB have done in the last months, and we are also doing, and try to move on very quickly in our relationship with SMEs and with our banks that are also adapting to move on.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all our excellent panelists for a just masterclass in how to promote sustainable finance in Portugal and the role in particular of the Banco de Fomento. So really appreciate it. We've only gone a few minutes over. Appreciate everyone's patience, and to the hosts for this great conference. I've just gotten a note, actually, that we have, a couple minutes more as our next our next speaker is joining in a moment, if that's right, from the presidency. Please interrupt me if I'm wrong, but I understand that there might be a little bit of room for a follow-on to our colleagues. I would love to take a second to circle back to Mr. De Sousa, if you have a moment to just comment on, if you may, and I think we only have a couple minutes, but I would love to hear your views on the complementarity of roles between the central bank and a promotional bank, and whether how you see their mandates complementing each other, in particular in the context of climate change and green finance promotion.
Thank you for the opportunity. As I said, central bank has to take a equidistant position, because we are also the supervisor of the banking sector, but that does not prevent us from having a position in this topic, and being very happy to be here participating together with the Banco de Fomento. In the capacity, in central bank's capacity, there are a number of areas that clearly they also interact with the banking system, and all the banks in particular, central banks, and I think this is common to the majority, if not all, the central banks. They have in their mandate the responsibility for financial stability, and when we're talking about a topic like climate change, sustainability, this is, I think, for a number of years now, it's very clear. There is no doubt that it clearly falls within the mandate of the central banks. If we're talking about climate change, if we're talking about the risks deriving from climate change, be it physical risks, be it transition risks, if we're talking about the huge investments that have to be carried in order to comply with this goal of achieving net zero or even negative zero. This all involves, for sure, the financial system. This is clearly something that has a very deep interaction with this mandate of central banks that to preserve financial stability. And financial stability is not an end in itself. It's something that is critical for all economic agents to be able to take their decisions, their investment decisions, their consumption decisions, their saving decisions. So it is critical for the society as a whole that we are capable of preserving financial stability. So this is, it's never enough to stress that there is this link. And one point that I had already made very briefly, and I would like to take this few more seconds just to stress, is that this idea that clearly, and I've heard today more than once the number of 1 trillion, regardless of whether that's a 1 trillion US or 1 trillion European, it's still a lot of zeros around it. It's a big number, so we're talking about a big investment. So this will require, in order to channel this amount of investment, this will require a combination of public, of private investment. This will require also what I would classify as a healthy combination of traditional financing and other types of financing, equity, quasi-capital, venture capital. And here I must stress that, having in mind one of my previous hats, that it is clearly in banks' long-term interest to encourage more market-based finance, even if it might not look that way at first sight. And the financial system as a whole has to play a role in channelizing the financial flows to support green investments. So I would say that given the magnitude of the role, there is clearly an opportunity for all financial institutions to be able to participate and eventually to specialize into this broad range of needs. And as a central bank, we can only we want to be part of it, of this, through the lenses, through the angles that we as central banks have to take care of, preserving financial stability, preserving price stability, ensuring that the macroprudential tools are in place, the supervisory, the supervision of each bank individually considered is adequate, and so coming to a conclusion in this, I think there is clearly a very important role for a number of financial entities that are capable of providing different products, different services that the magnitude of the challenge will require for the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists for sticking around for a little bit of extra inputs here. This is really great. On behalf of ClimateWorks Foundation, I have to say we've just been really excited to see the transformation of the Banco de Fomento and its establishment in this form, and the interest of the Portuguese government in particular of building on the experiences in other jurisdictions around green banks, soliciting the input of Vivid Economics, a great consultancy to inform the role this institution can play in a green, resilient recovery from COVID-19 on the path to mid-century decarbonization. And with that, I will pass it over to the minister who has now arrived. Thank you all, and have a great afternoon.
To close the conference, Sustainable Finance, New Developments, the Minister of State for the Economy and Digital Transition, Pedro Cisa Vieira, will take the floor.
Good afternoon to all participants in this conference. Sustainable finance is not only about making sure that financial institutions do take the principles of climate change at heart and at the core of their operations and how they assess their risks, but it also about how we make sure that we have the finance in place available for governments, companies, families to undertake the very significant investments that will be required to make sure that in the coming decades we can have an economy and a society which is prepared to be carbon neutral and have a circular economy. The level of the challenge is very significant. A number of companies will be impacted, and the way we transport, produce, manufacture goods will have to be significantly changed so that we can become a continent which will be carbon neutral by 2050. The bulk of the effort will have to be done in this coming decade. To make sure that we have the necessary resources to make all these investments, these accrued investments that will be required in the next few years, is going to take a lot of effort. Companies alone, taking advantage of their profits, their results, will not be able to sustain the effort that will be required to change their operations, their industrial processes, and their transportation efforts to make sure that we have these efforts. So unprecedented resources are being made available by governments and by the European Union to assist this effort that will be required. And as we have fit-for-purpose institutions, whether at EU level or national level, that are able to participate in these efforts, as we develop new financial products which provide companies and families the maturity and the cost which is required, we have to mobilize these efforts. Next Generation EU, the instrument, the Facility for Resilience and Recovery, the multi-financial year budget for the European Union will be significant sources of finance for this. But we can only achieve our goals if we are able to match these funds with the sources of private funding which will be required to make this effort. It will be a significant effort, but it promises also to deliver increased investment, providing an economic stimulus which will develop growth in the next few decades. The impact on business models will be significant, but at the same time, business opportunities will arise. Let me just state, as Minister for Economy in the Portuguese Republic, but also as chairing the European Union Council for Competitiveness, that we are very well aware that we must meet these challenges, which are required to make sure that we preserve the environment and our planet for future generations, that at the same time, we are well aware that we must make sure that the European Union economy continues to be competitive, and that these new technologies which will be required to achieve our climate change goals are delivered at the appropriate pace and at the level of cost which allows our economies to be sustainable. We must match the climate goals with the need to have a competitive economy. The European Union and the social model it has been built upon is dependent upon having competitive industries, competitive companies which can deliver jobs and pay the taxes which are required to sustain our social model. So this is the level of our challenge, and this is the promise of the coming decades, to match these very ambitious climate goals with the ability to deliver a competitive economy. It will be the need, it will be the role of finance systems, financial institutions, and the private sector to deliver the amount of financing which is required to finance all these increased change to match these two goals. I'm very well confident that the ambition that the European Union has put upon the Next Generation EU problem and the way we are aligning private sector and the public sector around these goals, that will be able to deliver this massive change that we need. I think that the conference today has identified clearly the challenges that we are facing, but also the framework for the coming decades. and we believe that we now have the institutional framework that is able to cope with these challenges. Thank you very much, and I enjoy your following day. Thank you.
We will now conclude the conference, Sustainable Finance, New Developments. We wish you all a good afternoon, and thank you for watching.